Art colleges are often vibrant places, brimming with creativity, innovation, and passion. Strokes of color transform blank canvases into masterpieces, and chisels give life to blocks of marble. This was no different at Westmore Art College, a small yet prestigious institution tucked away in the rolling hills of Vermont. Its annual student exhibition was not only a showcase of budding talent, but a social event that attracted art critics, collectors, and patrons from far and wide. Yet, this year's exhibition would leave an impression far darker than anyone anticipated. The centerpiece of the gallery was a painting that none of the students remembered submitting. It was hung in the central hall, a spot reserved for the most acclaimed works, though its origins were a mystery. The painting depicted a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of what appeared to be Westmore's own gallery. The figure's features were obscured, and the dim, desaturated tones contrasted sharply with the otherwise colorful displays surrounding it. The gallery director, Ms. Eliza Grant, brushed aside questions about its provenance, insisting it was an anonymous donation. "A piece like this invites interpretation," she said, though her smile seemed forced. Visitors to the gallery murmured uneasily as they passed the painting. Something about it was unnerving. No matter where one stood, the shadowed figure seemed to be staring directly at them, its hollow silhouette conveying a palpable malice. Some dismissed it as a clever optical illusion, while others whispered that the painting was too lifelike. It had a presence, an energy that gnawed at the edges of rational thought. By the end of the first day, the gallery was abuzz with rumors, but none could explain why standing in front of the painting felt like being watched by something far older than art itself. Among the students, curiosity about the painting turned into an obsession. Diana Cole, a third-year student specializing in oil paintings, decided to study it closely. She spent hours sketching it, trying to replicate the haunting effect of the shadowed figure. "The brushstrokes are flawless," she remarked to her friend Ethan. "Whoever painted this isn't just talented, they're a genius." Ethan wasn't convinced. "It's creepy," he muttered, "and I swear, when I looked at it this morning, the shadow was shorter. Like it's moving." By the end of the week, strange incidents began to plague the college. Students reported hearing faint whispers in the gallery, though no one else was there. Lights flickered in the main hall, and the gallery security cameras failed inexplicably. The janitor, Mr. Hargrove, claimed he saw the shadow in the painting stretch across the floor one night as he locked up. "It reached out," he stammered, his face pale as he recounted the story to a group of students. "Like it was trying to crawl out." Ms. Grant dismissed these stories as overactive imaginations fueled by the tension of the upcoming midterms. But even she avoided the central hall after sunset. Faculty members, usually quick to critique student theories, remained tight-lipped about the painting's origins. Whispers circulated about a curse, about art so potent it could transcend its medium. Some students began to stay away from the gallery altogether, while others, like Diana, grew increasingly obsessed. One fateful evening, Diana decided to stay late in the gallery, sketching the shadowed figure in an attempt to decode its mystery. The gallery was eerily silent, the usual hum of campus life replaced by a stillness that felt oppressive. As Diana worked, the lights above her began to dim and flicker. "Just a power surge," she muttered to herself, though her hands trembled as she gripped her pencil. The whispers began faintly, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of paper. But as she turned to face the painting, she realized the shadow had changed. It was no longer confined to the doorway. The figure had stepped forward, one foot emerging from the frame, its shadowed edges seeping onto the gallery floor. Diana froze, her breath caught in her throat as the air grew colder around her. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand, yet somehow felt were meant for her. She backed away slowly, her sketch pad falling to the ground. The next morning, Diana's sketchpad was found in the gallery, lying in front of the painting. Her half-finished drawing of the shadowed figure bore a chilling new detail. The shadow had eyes now, glowing faintly from the dark void. Diana herself was nowhere to be found. Her disappearance sparked panic across campus, but her friends noticed something even stranger. In the painting, The shadow now stood fully outside the doorway, its gaze fixed directly at the viewer. From that day forward, the painting was locked behind glass, though few dared to approach it. For the students at Westmore Art College, creativity had always been a source of life and inspiration. Now, it had become a doorway to something far more sinister, a dark reminder that art, like any other creation, could harbor secrets best left undiscovered. After Diana's disappearance, a somber air settled over Westmore Art College. Students whispered in hushed tones, their conversations tinged with fear and speculation. Faculty tried to project a sense of normalcy, but their forced smiles only deepened the unease. The gallery, once a vibrant hub of creativity, became a place most avoided. Though the annual exhibition remained open, fewer students and visitors attended each day. The haunting presence of the shadowed figure in the mysterious painting cast a long, oppressive shadow over the entire campus. Ethan, Diana's closest friend, was inconsolable. He spent hours retracing her last known steps, piecing together every detail of that fateful night. His investigations led him to the gallery, where he stood before the painting despite the knot of dread tightening in his chest. The figure now loomed larger than he remembered, its form more distinct, its edges sharper. The glowing eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw the faintest hint of movement within the painting, a flicker, like the ripple of a shadow against the light. Determined to find answers, Ethan began questioning others who had spent time in the gallery. To his surprise, many of them shared similar experiences. One student, Mia, described hearing soft murmurs whenever she was alone near the painting. Another, Caleb, claimed he felt a cold hand brush his arm as he walked past. Each story painted the same chilling picture. The painting was more than just a work of art. It was alive, and it was growing stronger. One night, Ethan convinced Mia and Caleb to accompany him back to the gallery. Armed with flashlights and their phones, they slipped in after hours, determined to unravel the painting's mystery. The silence of the gallery was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Their footsteps echoed eerily against the marble floors, each step amplifying the tension. As they approached the painting, a wave of cold washed over them, and the whispers began again, soft, unintelligible, and omnipresent. Ethan focused his flashlight on the painting, determined to document any changes. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing to the shadowed figure's feet. The figure's stance was subtly different, its position slightly more forward than it had been earlier that day. Mia shuddered and took a step back. "It's like it's trying to leave," she murmured, her voice trembling. Caleb, trying to mask his fear, scoffed. "It's just a trick of the light," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, as if the painting was responding to their presence. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching toward them like grasping hands. Panic set in as the gallery's lights began to dim, leaving the trio in near darkness. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice urgent. But before they could move, the painting emitted a low, guttural hum, a sound that resonated in their bones and filled their minds with dread. The gallery door slammed shut behind them, locking with an audible click. Mia screamed, pounding on the doors, while Caleb tried to pry them open. Ethan, however, couldn't take his eyes off the painting. The shadowed figure was now reaching out of the frame, its elongated arm stretching toward the edge of the canvas. The glowing eyes burned brighter, and for the first time, the whispers formed words. "Stay," they hissed in unison, reverberating through the gallery like a command. Ethan snapped out of his trance and yanked Mia and Caleb away from the doors. "The basement," he shouted. "There's another way out through the storage area." They sprinted toward the back of the gallery, the oppressive hum growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to follow them, creeping along the walls and ceiling. By the time they reached the basement door, their breaths were visible in the icy air. The storage basement was cluttered with old sculptures and used canvases and discarded art supplies. As they fumbled through the darkness, Ethan's flashlight caught something unusual in the corner of the room. A row of canvases covered in sheets. One had slipped partially off, revealing a painting eerily similar to the one upstairs. This one, however, depicted a different shadowed figure, its form twisted and skeletal. "What the hell is this?" Caleb whispered, his voice shaking. Before they could investigate further, a loud crash echoed from above. The whispers turned into screams, filling the gallery and spilling into the basement. Without hesitation, they pushed open the emergency exit and fled into the night, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Ethan turned to the others. "We need to figure out what's happening," he said, his voice resolute. "This isn't just a painting. It's something far worse." Though they had escaped the gallery, the events of that night would haunt them. The painting was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat, and whatever force was behind it wasn't confined to the canvas. It was spreading, inch by inch, shadow by shadow, into their lives. The discovery of the other shadowed painting in the basement turned Ethan's determination into an obsession. He spent the next day digging through the college's archives, searching for any record of the mysterious paintings. Westmore Art College, despite its long and storied history, kept meticulous documentation of its exhibitions, alumni, and faculty contributions. If the painting had been donated, there would be a record of it somewhere. Yet, after hours of poring over old catalogs and administrative notes, Ethan found nothing. The only clue came from an old maintenance ledger buried in the back of a filing cabinet. A single-line item from nearly a decade earlier mentioned the installation of unlabeled artworks in the gallery's storage basement. There was no artist listed, no description of the pieces, and no further records explaining why they had been stored or forgotten. Ethan's curiosity burned brighter. "Someone had to paint these," he muttered to himself. "But why would they hide them?" Mia and Caleb, though rattled by the previous night's events, reluctantly agreed to help Ethan. The trio decided to visit the basement again, this time during the day, when the gallery was less foreboding. Armed with better flashlights and a sense of urgency, they descended the creaking staircase into the storage area. The row of canvases stood where they had left them, draped in dusty sheets. Ethan carefully removed the covering from the painting they had seen the night before, revealing the full, grotesque figure. Unlike the upstairs painting, this shadowed figure wasn't simply standing. It was crawling, its elongated limbs stretched unnaturally as though it were dragging itself forward. The eyes were hollow sockets, but they seemed to stare directly into Ethan's soul. Beneath the figure was a faint signature, barely legible under layers of dark paint. "D. Vasseur," Mia read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's that?" The name didn't appear in any of Westmore's official records. A search of the college's digital archives turned up nothing, and none of the faculty or older students recognized it. "Maybe they weren't a student or teacher here," Caleb suggested. "Could have been an outsider who used the gallery for something." Ethan wasn't convinced. The style of the paintings, their eerie precision, and their unnatural presence felt too deliberate to be the work of an obscure artist. Their investigation took a chilling turn when Ethan stumbled upon an online forum dedicated to forbidden art. Buried deep within the threads was a single mention of D. Vasseur, a reclusive artist whose work had been banned from several major exhibitions due to its psychological effects on viewers. Rumors swirled that Vasseur's paintings weren't just unsettling, they were dangerous. Several pieces had allegedly been destroyed after gallery visitors reported hallucinations, insomnia, and even violent behavior. Ethan's stomach turned as he read a chilling line from one commenter. "Vasseur's work doesn't depict shadows. It summons them." Meanwhile, the painting in the gallery seemed to grow more menacing by the day. Visitors reported feeling physically ill after standing near it. A security guard quit without explanation, leaving behind only a scrawled note that read, "It's watching." Even the janitor, Mr. Hargrove, refused to clean the central hall. "That thing doesn't belong here," he told Ethan. "It doesn't belong anywhere." Despite these warnings, Ethan grew increasingly fixated on uncovering the truth. He theorized that the shadowed figures in the paintings weren't static. They were progressing, moving closer to something, or perhaps someone. What if these paintings are connected? He suggested during one of their late-night discussions. Like steps in a ritual or a process. Mia shook her head. That's insane, she said. They're just paintings, Ethan. Creepy, sure, but they're not alive. Yet deep down, Mia wasn't so sure. She had started dreaming about the painting. Dreams in which the shadowed figure whispered her name, its glowing eyes burning brighter each time. Caleb, too, confessed to hearing faint knocks on his dorm room door at night, though no one was ever there. It's like the shadows are following us, he admitted. The trio began to wonder if their investigation was putting them in danger. Desperate for answers, Ethan proposed one final plan. We need to find out what happened to Vasseur, he said. If we can understand who they were, maybe we can figure out how to stop this. His suggestion was met with silence, the weight of their fear palpable. Finally, Mia nodded. Fine, she said, but if this gets worse, we're done. No more paintings, no more gallery, no more shadows. The first step was to visit the town library, which housed local records predating the college's archives. There, amid stacks of dusty newspapers and forgotten microfilm, Ethan uncovered an article from 1979 about a series of mysterious deaths linked to an artist named Dorian Vasseur. According to the piece, Vasseur had been accused of practicing occult rituals under the guise of creating art. The article ended abruptly, with no mention of a trial or conviction. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Why had Vasseur's name been erased from public memory? And why had their paintings found their way into Westmore Art College? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the trio left the library with more questions than answers. Yet one thing was certain. Whatever force had been unleashed through the paintings, it wasn't finished with them yet. The trio's discovery of Dorian Vasseur's dark history left them more unnerved than ever. It was no longer a question of mere art, but of something far more sinister. Ethan, Mia, and Caleb realized that to uncover the truth, they would need to dig deeper into Vasseur's life and the circumstances that had led their works to Westmore Art College. The trail felt cold, but Ethan refused to give up. Artists leave traces, he said. Vasseur had to have work somewhere. Maybe there's a studio, a residence, something we can find. Their search took them to the town's outskirts, where whispers of an old abandoned building led them to a forgotten part of the industrial district. The locals referred to it as the Unmarked Studio, a place where strange happenings had been rumored for decades. Once the site of a thriving artist collective, it had been shuttered abruptly in the late 1970s, around the same time Vasseur's name had surfaced in connection with the mysterious deaths. As they approached the decrepit building, the atmosphere grew heavier. Vines clawed at the crumbling brick walls, and broken windows stared back at them like empty eyes. A faded plaque near the door bore no name, only the numbers 1976. Ethan pushed the door open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the darkened halls, their flashlights casting long, wavering shadows. The first few rooms were unremarkable, storage spaces filled with rusted tools, broken easels, and faded canvases. But as they ventured deeper, the mood shifted. The walls began to show faint traces of black, swirling patterns that looked more like burns than paint. The designs were chaotic, almost fractal in nature, and seemed to pulse under the flashlight beams. "What is this?" Mia whispered, running her fingers over the patterns. The surface was cold, and her touch left a smear of black on her skin. The trio's search led them to the heart of the building, a cavernous main studio that still bore signs of its past life. Tables were strewn with paintbrushes, jars of dried paint, and brittle sheets of paper. But the centerpiece of the room was an enormous canvas, still mounted on an easel. Unlike the other forgotten remnants, this painting seemed untouched by time. It was another shadowed figure, larger and more detailed than the ones they'd seen before. Its form was twisted into an agonized pose, as if it were trying to escape the very frame that imprisoned it. Beneath the painting, etched into the wooden frame, was a series of strange symbols. Ethan snapped pictures while Caleb examined the area for anything resembling a signature. No D. Vasseur here, Caleb said, his voice tinged with unease. But these symbols, they're like the ones we saw on the walls. They're everywhere. Mia's flashlight flickered as she stepped closer to the painting. The air around it felt colder, almost sharp, and she swore she could hear faint whispers again. "Guys," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. We shouldn't be here." Before they could respond, the room shuddered as if something massive had shifted in the building's foundation. A deep, resonant hum filled the space, making their bones vibrate. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, detaching themselves and slithering toward the trio. Panic set in as the shadows converged, forming a swirling mass near the painting. The figure within the canvas seemed to come alive, its anguished form twisting as if in response to the growing darkness. Ethan yelled for them to run, but the studio seemed to resist their escape. Doors slammed shut, and the blackened patterns on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Caleb grabbed a rusted stool and smashed a window, creating an opening large enough to crawl through. "Go!" he shouted, shoving Mia toward the jagged frame. She hesitated, glancing back at Ethan, who was still staring at the painting. "Ethan, come on," she screamed. He tore his gaze away and scrambled toward the window just as the shadows surged forward, filling the space where they had stood moments before. Outside, the trio gasped for air, their hands and clothes smeared with grime and blood from the broken glass. The hum from the studio faded, but the memory of the writhing shadows lingered in their minds. Ethan clutched the camera, its strap tangled around his wrist. "We have to look at the pictures," he said, his voice shaking. "There might be something we missed." Back in Mia's dorm, they huddled around her laptop, scrolling through the photos. Most were blurry, the movement and chaos of their escape captured in frantic, distorted frames. But one image stood out, a clear shot of the painting symbols. Ethan zoomed in, revealing details they hadn't noticed before. The symbols weren't random. They formed a sequence, like a coded message or a set of instructions. Mia's hands trembled as she traced the symbols on the screen. "What if this isn't just a painting?" she said. "What if it's a gateway? Or a prison?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The trio exchanged uneasy glances, the enormity of their discovery sinking in. Whatever Dorian Vasseur had created, it wasn't art in the conventional sense. It was something darker, something alive, and it wasn't finished with them yet. The images from Ethan's camera consumed their thoughts in the days following the escape from the unmarked studio. Each symbol burned into their memories, and their cryptic arrangement gnawed at their collective sanity. While Mia was convinced the painting served as some kind of gateway, Ethan believed it might have been a warning, a desperate attempt by Dorian Vasseur to contain whatever had haunted their art. Caleb, however, grew quieter with each passing day, his once narky demeanor replaced by a distant, haunted look. "I keep hearing it," Caleb muttered during one of their late-night meetings in Mia's dorm. His face was pale, and dark shadows hung under his eyes. At night, whispers like they're coming from inside the walls. "It's the same voice I heard in the studio." Ethan and Mia exchanged uneasy glances. They, too, had been experiencing strange phenomena. Fleeting shadows darting in the corners of their vision, cold drafts in otherwise warm rooms, and most unsettling of all, a sense that they were never truly alone. Ethan decided they needed help. Westmore had its share of eccentric professors, and one name immediately came to mind: Dr. Lila Greaves, an art history professor known for her controversial theories on occult influences in modern art. Despite her reputation as a fringe academic, Dr. Greaves was well respected for her vast knowledge of esoteric symbology and artistic movements that skirted the line between the spiritual and the forbidden. When Ethan showed her the photo of the symbols, her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and she visibly recoiled from the screen. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Ethan hesitated before giving her a sanitized version of the story. He omitted the living shadows and their near-death escape from the studio. Dr. Greaves leaned back in her chair, her face pale. This is dangerous," she said. She explained that the symbols were part of an ancient practice known as Aesthetica Umbri, or the art of shadows, a long-lost tradition believed to merge artistic expression with summoning rituals. According to legend, practitioners of Aesthetica Umbri didn't merely depict darkness in their works. They used their art to draw it into the world. These symbols, Dr. Greaves said, pointing to Ethan's photo, are a binding sequence. Whoever painted this was trying to seal something away. Her words sent a chill through Ethan. Mia's theory about the painting being a prison seemed eerily plausible now. But if it was a prison, what was it containing? And had they accidentally begun to undo the binding by disturbing the painting? Meanwhile, Caleb's condition worsened. He stopped attending classes and refused to leave his room, claiming the whispers had grown louder. "They're not just voices," he said in a strained phone call to Mia. "They're inviting me, telling me to come back to the studio." That night, Mia and Ethan decided to check on Caleb in person. When they arrived at his dorm, they found his door ajar. The room was in disarray, with books, clothes, and even the mattress tossed aside as if in a frantic search. On the wall, drawn in jagged, charcoal-like strokes, were the same symbols from the painting. Caleb was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as they realized the symbols formed a path leading to Caleb's desk, where a single sheet of paper lay. Ethan picked it up and read aloud. "The shadow calls me home." Beneath the words was a rough sketch of the painting from the studio, its figure now standing upright, arms outstretched as though in triumph. Without hesitation, they called the campus police, but the response was dismissive. Caleb's disappearance was filed as a possible runaway, and no one seemed interested in the bizarre symbols. Frustrated, Mia and Ethan knew they had no choice but to return to the unmarked studio. Whatever had taken Caleb, it was connected to that place. Their journey back was fraught with tension. The industrial district was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the abandoned structures. The studio loomed ahead, its presence darker and more imposing than before. As they stepped inside, the oppressive atmosphere was immediate, weighing on their chests like a physical force. The main studio was exactly as they'd left it, except for one chilling difference. The central painting had changed. The shadowed figure was no longer twisted in agony. It stood tall and proud, its once empty sockets now glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Around the base of the easel lay a faint outline in the dust, the shape unmistakable. It was a body. "Caleb," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. Before they could process the scene, a low hum began to build, resonating through the walls. The patterns on the walls started to pulse again, brighter and more frantic. Shadows began to coalesce in the corners of the room, slithering toward the painting. Ethan grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her toward the exit, but the shadows moved faster, closing in and blocking their path. As the hum grew deafening, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the studio, coming not from the shadows, but from the painting itself. "The seal is broken." Mia screamed as the shadows surged forward, enveloping the room in complete darkness. Mia awoke to silence, her body sprawled across a cold, hard floor. Her head throbbed, and her vision blurred as she struggled to make sense of her surroundings. The suffocating darkness had lifted, replaced by a dim, gray light that bathed the room in an eerie glow. The studio no longer looked like the decaying structure they had entered. It was as if the place had transformed, its walls smooth and unblemished, pulsating faintly with that same fractal pattern they had seen before. "Ethan?" Mia's voice cracked as she called out, but the only response was the faint hum that now seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding as she took in her surroundings. The painting was still there, but it had changed yet again. The shadowed figure was gone, leaving the canvas blank save for the jagged symbols etched around its edges. Mia's breath hitched as she heard a faint sound, a low, guttural groan. Turning quickly, she spotted Ethan crumpled in a corner, his body trembling. She rushed to him, shaking his shoulders. "Ethan, wake up," she whispered frantically. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her with a mixture of relief and terror. "They're here," he whispered. "Who's here?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Ethan pointed behind her, and Mia froze. Turning slowly, she saw the shadows moving again, But this time, they weren't amorphous. They had taken on distinct shapes. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces, their forms flickering as though they existed halfway between this world and another. The figures encircled them, their movements slow and deliberate. One stepped forward, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying them. "You brought us here," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers layered atop one another. "The seal is broken. The abyss calls." Mia clenched her fists, fear threatening to paralyze her. "We didn't mean to. We just want our friend back," she shouted, her voice cracking. "The one who answered the call belongs to us now," the shadow replied, its voice colder. "You seek what you do not understand. The darkness has been freed, and there is no undoing it." Ethan staggered to his feet, his jaw clenched. "We didn't free anything. This was Dorian Vasseur's doing. He created you, didn't he?" His words hung in the air, defiant yet desperate. The shadow's head tilted again, almost curiously. Vasseur was the first, it said, but his art was not creation. It was imprisonment. His fear birthed the seal, and his defiance kept us chained. Now through you his failure is undone. Before Mia could process the shadow's words, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Cracks spiderwebbed across the floor, and from them emerged tendrils of inky blackness, reaching toward the painting. The shadows began to merge with the canvas, their forms dissolving as they were absorbed into the empty frame. Ethan grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her away from the growing darkness. "We have to move now," he shouted. Together, they stumbled toward the door, but every step felt heavier, as though the air itself were fighting against them. The studio seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit impossibly far. Mia's lungs burned as she ran, her thoughts racing. Caleb was gone. The painting had become a portal to something unfathomable, and now it seemed as though they, too, were being pulled into its grasp. Just as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing them inside. The walls around them began to close in, the fractal patterns twisting into grotesque faces that screamed silently. Ethan slammed his fists against the door, yelling in frustration. "Stop!" Mia screamed. "It's feeding off our fear. That's what it wants." Ethan froze, his breathing ragged. "Then what do we do?" Mia looked back at the painting. The shadows were nearly gone, fully absorbed into the canvas, which now glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. The symbols etched into its frame pulsed, each beat growing slower, as though it were stabilizing. "Dorian Vasseur imprisoned them," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we could do the same?" "How?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Mia admitted. "But we can't let them escape completely. If the painting is the key, then we have to finish what Vasseur started." The room fell silent as they turned back toward the painting. Whatever lay beyond it was watching, waiting. The next move would be theirs, and the stakes had never been higher. Mia's declaration hung in the air like a challenge, her words echoing faintly in the studio that now felt more alive than ever. Ethan stared at her, wide-eyed, his chest heaving from exertion. "You want us to do what Dorian Vasseur couldn't? He was a master, Mia. We're just..." He trailed off, gesturing helplessly. "We're just what?" Mia snapped, her frustration boiling over. "Students? Amateurs? That doesn't matter anymore, Ethan. Caleb is gone, and whatever's behind that painting is going to escape if we don't do something." Her voice broke, and Ethan could see the tears brimming in her eyes. He clenched his fists and nodded. "Okay, let's figure this out." The painting now pulsed like a living heart, its faint glow casting unsettling shadows across the room. As the last remnants of the shadow figures vanished into the canvas, the studio fell eerily silent. The oppressive hum that had filled the air moments before was gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Ethan approached the painting cautiously, his hands trembling. "If this is a seal," he murmured, "then it's a ritual. There's a pattern, a process. We just need to figure out how Vasseur made it." Mia scanned the room, her eyes darting to the scattered debris. Among the shattered frames and overturned easels, she spotted a small, leather-bound notebook partially hidden under a pile of broken glass. She lunged for it, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The notebook was filled with frantic sketches and hastily scrawled notes, many of which were illegible. But near the center of the book, she found a page with a rough diagram of the symbols they'd seen on the painting. Beside it, in cramped handwriting, was a single line that sent chills down her spine. The canvas binds the form, but the artist binds the soul. Ethan, Mia whispered, showing him the page. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he read the cryptic note. The artist binds the soul. What does that even mean? Mia shook her head. I don't know, but it's a clue. Vasseur must have used more than just paint to create the seal. Maybe it's symbolic, like a sacrifice, or something he poured into the art to give it power. Ethan paled. A sacrifice? Before Mia could respond, the room began to shift again. The walls quivered, and the floor beneath them seemed to ripple like water. The painting's glow intensified, and from its surface, faint shapes began to emerge, wisps of darkness that coalesced into barely humanoid forms. We're running out of time, Ethan said, his voice tight with fear. Desperation overtook them as they scrambled to assemble whatever supplies they could find. Ethan located an untouched palette and a set of brushes, while Mia uncovered jars of pigment, some dried and others still viscous. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The notebook mentions binding the soul, Mia said as she worked to recreate the symbols on a nearby canvas. Maybe we need to pour our intent into the art like Vasseur did. If he was trying to imprison the darkness, we have to do the same. Ethan hesitated, watching her work with shaky hands. What if it's not enough? Mia paused, her breath catching. Then we don't stop them, and the world gets swallowed by whatever's inside that thing. So let's hope it's enough. The shadows in the room grew bolder, closing in around them. Their whispers were louder now, a cacophony of unintelligible voices that seemed to burrow into their minds. Mia gritted her teeth and focused on the symbols, replicating them as precisely as she could. As Ethan prepared the pigments, his hands brushed against a peculiar jar filled with a deep crimson liquid. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive. Mia, he called out, holding up the jar. I think this is what Vasseur used. Mia looked at him, her face pale. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. It's not paint. It feels different, like blood. She hesitated, then grabbed the jar. We don't have a choice. Mia dipped her brush into the crimson liquid and began tracing the final symbols onto the new canvas. The moment the brush touched the surface, the studio shook violently, and the shadows recoiled as if in pain. The whispers turned into screams, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. Mia, it's working! Ethan shouted over the din, his voice filled with both fear and hope. The painting on the easel began to warp, its glowing surface rippling as though resisting the new seal. The symbols Mia painted seemed to radiate light, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. But then, from the heart of the original painting, a figure began to emerge. It was the shadowed form they had seen before, now fully realized and terrifying in its presence. Its featureless face turned toward them, and it spoke in a voice that was both deafening and eerily calm. You cannot bind what has already been freed. Mia froze, her brush hovering above the canvas. Ethan grabbed her arm. Don't stop. Finish it. With a final stroke, Mia completed the last symbol. The room erupted in blinding light, and a piercing scream tore through the studio. The shadows dissolved, and the figure collapsed into itself, drawn back into the painting like smoke into a bottle. As the light faded, the studio returned to its original, decrepit state. The painting on the easel was now blank, and the oppressive atmosphere was gone. Mia and Ethan collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. For a moment, all was silent. Then Ethan whispered, "Did we do it?" Mia stared at the blank canvas, her hands still trembling. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think we just made something worse." The oppressive stillness in the studio gave way to an eerie quiet, the kind that made every sound feel amplified. Mia and Ethan remained slumped on the floor, their breathing shallow. The blank canvas before them stood as a testament to their desperate effort, yet it offered no reassurance. The malevolent energy had dissipated, but it left behind a hollow sensation, as if something crucial had been severed, and not necessarily for the better. Ethan broke the silence first. What if it's not over? His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. Mia turned to him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. "It's never that simple, is it?" she replied. Her gaze flicked to the original painting, now inert. The jagged symbols on its frame had dulled, their glow extinguished. "I think we've stopped something, but not everything." Ethan rubbed his temples. The shadows, they didn't seem like they were the source, more like messengers or pawns. Mia nodded, and the figure, it spoke to us. It knew us. That's not something you just erase with a few brushstrokes. She stood shakily and approached the painting, hesitant but compelled. The surface, once alive with unnatural energy, now seemed dull and ordinary. Yet as her fingers hovered near it, a faint sensation of heat radiated outward. "Don't touch it," Ethan warned, scrambling to his feet. "I wasn't going to," Mia shot back, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Something about the painting called to her, an unspoken invitation that she couldn't fully ignore. Ethan stepped beside her, his face pale. "We need to figure out what we've done. That notebook, it said the canvas binds the form, but the artist binds the soul. What if binding the soul wasn't what Vasseur intended? What if he..." Ethan trailed off, his words faltering under the weight of their implications. "What if he tried to destroy it?" Mia finished for him. Her voice was somber, each word a heavy weight. Before Ethan could respond, the air in the room grew colder. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that their breath became visible, hanging in front of them like fragile smoke. A low, vibrating hum filled the space, not as overwhelming as before, but insidious, creeping into their bones. Mia clutched her arms for warmth. "This isn't over," she muttered, her words almost drowned by the rising sound. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, and the painting on the easel they had just created shattered into pieces, as though struck by an unseen force. The shards fell to the floor, leaving behind a gaping emptiness where their work had once stood. Ethan stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. "What the hell was that?" Mia didn't answer. She was staring at the wall behind the easel, where a series of symbols had etched themselves into the plaster, glowing faintly. They were the same symbols she had painted, but they pulsed with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Mia replied, her voice hollow. She took a step closer, drawn once again despite the fear clawing at her chest. "It's like the seal rejected us. Like it wasn't enough." Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, pacing in frantic circles. "Then what do we do? If we can't bind it, and we can't destroy it, what's left?" Before Mia could answer, the symbols on the wall began to shift, rearranging themselves. The room quaked slightly, and a faint whisper filled the air. It was incomprehensible at first, but as it grew louder, the words became clear. "The seal is incomplete. The artist must finish." Ethan's face went pale, his eyes darting to Mia. "It's talking to us," he whispered. "No," Mia replied, her voice trembling. "It's talking to me." The symbols glowed brighter, and the whispers faded, leaving only silence. Mia took another step toward the wall, her hand outstretched. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his voice. "I don't know," Mia admitted, "but it's calling me. I think it wants me to finish what Vasseur started." Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "You don't know what it's asking. You don't even know what that means." Mia shook him off, her eyes fixed on the glowing symbols. "Neither did Vasseur, but he tried anyway. If we don't, this thing will consume everything." The room seemed to hold its breath as Mia picked up the broken pieces of the crimson-stained canvas. She gathered the shards and turned to Ethan. "Help me find another canvas. We're not done yet." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded, the weight of their task pressing down on both of them. They didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. They were no longer simply observers in Vasseur's legacy. They had become part of it. And whatever came next would demand far more than paint and brushes. It would demand the very essence of who they were. The hallway outside the studio felt colder than the room they had just fled. Ethan and Mia moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty corridors of the art college. The once familiar space now seemed hostile, every shadow too deep, every noise too sharp. Mia carried the broken shards of the crimson-stained canvas in her hands, her fingers trembling but determined. Ethan followed close behind, his eyes darting nervously to the darkened corners of the hall. "We can't just paint on any canvas," Mia muttered, half to herself. "It has to be something significant." Ethan frowned. Significant how? Like historically? Spiritually? He was trying to lighten the mood, but his voice betrayed his unease. "I don't know," Mia replied, "but I think we'll know it when we see it." They reached the storage room at the far end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Inside, rows of canvases, easels, and supplies were stacked haphazardly. The room smelled of turpentine and old paint, a scent that should have been comforting, but now seemed oppressive. As they stepped inside, the door creaked ominously, and the faint hum of static filled the air. Ethan instinctively reached for the light switch, but Mia grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Whatever this thing is, I don't think it likes the light." Ethan hesitated but nodded, his hand falling back to his side. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the emergency exit sign in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Mia scanned the shelves, her eyes darting over the stacks of blank canvases. They all seemed lifeless, devoid of the energy she felt compelled to find. Frustrated, she turned to Ethan. "This isn't right. None of these feel alive." Ethan finished for her, his tone equal parts sarcastic and terrified. Before Mia could respond, a low thud reverberated through the room. They both froze, their eyes snapping toward the source of the sound. A large, dust-covered canvas leaned against the far wall, partially obscured by a pile of discarded frames. "That one," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan frowned. "You're just guessing." "No," she insisted. "I can feel it." Reluctantly, Ethan helped her move the debris aside, revealing the canvas in full. It was massive, far larger than any standard size, and its surface was stretched tightly over an ornate, blackened frame carved with intricate patterns. The symbols etched into the wood were faint, but unmistakably similar to the ones that had appeared on the wall in the studio. As Mia reached out to touch it, the air in the room seemed to shift. A sudden wave of heat radiated from the canvas, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls were closing in. Ethan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. "Mia, don't!" But it was too late. Her fingers grazed the surface, and the room erupted in a cacophony of sound. A deafening roar filled the air, accompanied by a piercing, metallic screech that made their ears ring. The canvas pulsed with an otherworldly light, the symbols on its frame glowing bright red. Mia stumbled back, clutching her head. "It's alive," she gasped. "This is it. This is the one." Ethan stared at the canvas, his face pale. "And what happens if we use it? What if it's a trap?" Mia shook her head, her eyes locked on the pulsating surface. "It's not a trap. It's a key. It's what Vasseur was trying to use to end this." Ethan swallowed hard, his fear mounting. Or it's what he used to unleash it in the first place. Mia turned to him, her expression resolute. "Either way, it's the only chance we have." With trembling hands, they lifted the canvas and carried it back to the studio. The weight of it was far greater than it should have been, as if it were imbued with something far heavier than wood and fabric. As they entered the studio, the air thickened once more, the oppressive energy returning with a vengeance. They placed the canvas on the easel, and Mia stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans. Ethan stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. "Now what?" Mia picked up her brush, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. "Now we finish what Vasseur started. Whatever it takes." The room seemed to hold its breath as Mia dipped her brush into the crimson paint, the color darker than blood. The first stroke on the canvas sent a shiver down their spines, as if the act had awakened something ancient and waiting. Ethan watched in silence, the weight of their task pressing down on him like a physical force. He didn't know if they were saving the world or damning it further. All he knew was that they had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The air in the studio was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel laborious and every movement feel too loud. As Mia's brush dipped into the crimson paint, the colors seemed to absorb the light around it, deepening with every stroke as though feeding off the very energy in the room. Ethan watched, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what was happening, or what would happen once the painting was complete. Every time Mia lifted the brush and applied another layer, the temperature in the room dropped slightly, a cold draft sweeping through the studio despite the lack of windows or ventilation. It was as though the painting itself was pulling in the warmth, and with it, the life force of everything around it. Ethan felt a strange dizziness beginning to cloud his vision, the shadows at the edge of the room stretching out unnaturally. He gripped the edge of the nearby desk to steady himself. Mia didn't seem to notice. Her focus was unwavering, her hands moving with a speed and precision that unnerved him. The canvas seemed to grow before their eyes, not just in size but in substance, as if the painting itself were becoming more than it was, a living thing, an extension of something dark and ancient. She paused for a moment, glancing at the symbols on the frame, her expression unreadable. "I think we're close," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan swallowed hard. Close to what? His voice was strained, and for the first time, he could sense the true depth of his fear. The unease had been building ever since they began this absurd, dangerous process, but now it was overwhelming. This doesn't feel right. We're playing with forces we don't understand. Mia met his gaze. "You said it yourself, Ethan. We can't stop now. If we don't finish this," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I didn't mean it like that." Ethan snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "I didn't mean finish it like this. We have no idea what this is going to do." Mia's jaw tightened. "It's the only way. It's the only way to stop it from consuming everything." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft hum of the unnatural energy around them. Ethan could feel it now, crawling under his skin, an almost tangible force pushing against him. He could sense that something was wrong, far more wrong than he could put into words. The brush moved once more, and with it, a series of unsettling sounds filled the room. The canvas shuddered, and the light from the studio's dim lamp flickered, casting strange, warped shadows across the walls. The temperature plummeted, and with it came a low, vibrating hum. It was the same sound that had filled the air when they first encountered the painting in the storage room. It was alive. Suddenly Mia stopped. She stared at the painting, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It is not right," she whispered. Ethan felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean it's not right?" Mia stepped back, her hand trembling as she reached for the canvas. But she stopped just short of touching it, her fingers hovering over the surface. It's changing. It's not the same as before." The room seemed to contract around them, the walls closing in as the sound grew louder, more insistent. The canvas itself began to ripple, as though it were made of liquid rather than fabric. The symbols on the frame twisted, shifting in impossible ways. Mia took a step forward, drawn to the painting against her will. I can't stop it," she muttered, her voice distant and hollow. Ethan rushed to her side, grabbing her arm. "Mia, snap out of it," he shouted, his panic now taking control. "Whatever's happening, you need to get away from it. It's feeding on you." But Mia was already beyond his reach. Her eyes had glazed over, and her expression was blank, as though the painting had taken possession of her. Her hand, still trembling, finally touched the surface of the canvas. The moment she made contact, the room erupted in a blinding flash of red. Ethan was thrown back, landing hard on the floor. His vision swam as the sound of 1,000 voices screamed in his ears. The air was thick with a foul, acrid scent, and the floor beneath him seemed to shift, as though the very foundation of the studio was crumbling away. When the light subsided, Ethan pushed himself up, his head spinning. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. The studio was still intact, but something was different. The symbols on the frame had spread across the walls, the once faint markings now etched deeply into every surface. The shadows had deepened, and the air was thick with a sense of dread that suffocated him. Mia stood motionless in front of the canvas, her hands still resting on it. But she wasn't herself anymore. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and utterly devoid of recognition. She whispered in a voice that was not hers. "The artist is bound. The soul is free." Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized that Mia was no longer in control. The entity, whatever it was, had taken hold of her. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to do something, anything, before it was too late. "Mia," he shouted, his voice desperate. But she didn't respond. Instead, the painting began to shift again, the figures within it writhing, as though alive. The edges of the canvas twisted, and for a split second, Ethan thought he saw a face staring back at him. Pale, gaunt, and twisted in agony. It was Vasseur. A wave of cold dread washed over him. They hadn't just finished the painting. They had completed it, and in doing so, they had freed something far darker than they could have imagined. The aftermath of Mia's transformation had left Ethan disoriented, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn in two. He stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the full extent of what had happened. The painting before him had not only altered its form, but it seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The air was thick with an oppressive presence, a silent pressure that weighed down on him with every breath. The shadows, once merely a backdrop to the room, now seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, crawling along the walls and floor like living tendrils. Mia remained motionless in front of the painting, her body stiff and her expression vacant. She no longer resembled the person Ethan had known, the vibrant, passionate artist who had once been full of dreams and ideals. Now, she was a hollow vessel, possessed by something that was neither human nor fully alive. Her eyes, once a deep brown, had turned to cold, inhuman black, and her mouth hung slightly open, as if waiting for a command from an unseen force. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. What had they done? They had completed the painting, yes, but at what cost? The feeling of dread, which had started as a whisper in the back of his mind, now roared to the forefront of his consciousness. It was as if the room itself was alive, feeding off the unnatural energy released by the completed work. And yet, the worst part was the realization that they had somehow unleashed something far beyond their understanding. The painting was no longer a mere object of art. It was a conduit, a gateway to something darker, something that had been waiting. The sound of Mia's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts, though it was no longer hers. The words she spoke were foreign, ancient, reverberating in a way that seemed to echo in his very bones. "The artist is bound," Mia said in a voice that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "The soul is free, but not for long." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words made no sense, and yet they felt heavy with meaning. The painting had done something to her, something irreversible. She was no longer Mia, not entirely. He could sense the shift, the distortion in the air around him. He wasn't just in a room anymore. He was in a space between realities where the rules of physics and nature no longer applied. The boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead had blurred, and the painting was the bridge. He needed to do something. He couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. But what? How could he undo what had been done? His eyes darted around the room, searching for a solution, but everything seemed alien. The symbols on the walls, once faint and barely noticeable, now pulsed with a malignant energy. They were not just drawings. They were runes, powerful and insidious, etched into the very bones of the studio. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy that was not natural, a hum that resonated deep within Ethan's chest. Then it hit him. He had seen these symbols before. The forgotten books in the library, the ones with the tattered pages and the strange, indecipherable language. The text that spoke of forbidden rituals, of summoning and binding, of the price of creation. He had dismissed them at the time, thinking them to be nothing more than fanciful fiction, the ramblings of an artist's desperate mind. But now, In the aftermath of their actions, it was clear that those books were more than just stories. They were warnings. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized the truth. The painting was not just a creation, it was a binding. By completing it, Mia had not only brought something into the world, but had also imprisoned a piece of herself within it. The entity that had taken hold of her was not just an external force. It was a reflection of her own psyche, twisted and corrupted by the act of creation. And now, the entity was free, but Mia was trapped. "Mia," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with desperation. He took a tentative step toward her, but the shadows in the room seemed to shift, blocking his path. The air grew colder still, and a low growl reverberated from the walls. The painting's surface rippled again, as though reacting to Ethan's movements. The once still figures within the canvas were now writhing, their eyes wide with torment, their mouths open in silent screams. But it was not just the figures in the painting that moved. Ethan could feel something behind him, something watching, waiting. The very air around him seemed to hum with an unseen presence, an intelligence that was not human. He had to act. There was no time to waste. Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the old, brittle pages of the books he had found in the library. He needed the knowledge, the ritual that could undo this. He needed to bind the entity back into the painting, to trap it before it could fully manifest in the real world. But the knowledge was incomplete. The books had been damaged, their pages torn, their instructions cryptic and fragmented. As Ethan began to recite the words he could remember, a shrill scream tore through the room, cutting him off mid-chant. The room seemed to spin, the shadows lengthening and converging around him. The scream was not Mia's. It was something far older, far more primal. He turned, his heart racing, only to find Mia's form trembling violently. She was still standing in front of the painting, but her body was convulsing, as though she were being torn apart from the inside out. The blackness in her eyes deepened, and her mouth opened wide, a soundless scream echoing from her throat. Ethan's stomach lurched as the air around him grew thick with an oppressive weight. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The price of creation had come due. Mia had opened the door, but now she couldn't close it, and neither could he. The painting pulsed once more, and Mia's body jerked violently, as if being pulled into the canvas itself. It was too late. The room fell into an eerie silence after Mia's transformation. Ethan stood frozen in place, paralyzed by a dread so profound that it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. The painting in front of him, once a work of abstract beauty, had become a grotesque, pulsating entity. Its forms twisted unnaturally, its shapes contorting as though something was trying to escape from within. The light in the room seemed dimmer now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, creeping along the walls like living tendrils. Ethan's mind raced, searching for an explanation, for some thread of hope, but there was nothing. Mia, once his closest confidant and partner in this dark artistic journey, had all but vanished. Her body convulsed in an unearthly rhythm, her once familiar features contorted in ways that defied human anatomy. She was not herself anymore. She had become an instrument, a vessel for something far older and far more powerful than either of them had ever understood. The energy in the room was suffocating, as though the space itself had been corrupted, invaded by an unknowable force. Ethan's gaze fell to the painting again, drawn to the unsettling movement within its depths. It was no longer a reflection of the real world. It was a window, a portal perhaps, to something that should never have been touched. The faces within the painting no longer represented people. They were twisted, contorted figures, their eyes wide with agony, their mouths open in silent screams. And at the very center of the painting, something dark and formless shifted, pulsating with a strange rhythm, like the beating of a heart. The thought struck Ethan like a lightning bolt. Mia had opened the door. She had completed the ritual. But had she meant to? Was she fully aware of what she had done when she finished the painting? He had always believed that art was a reflection of the self, a means of expressing the deepest parts of the soul. But now he wondered if it was more than that. What if art was a conduit, a way for something beyond the human realm to manifest itself in this world. And if that was true, what had they unleashed? What was the price of creation? A strange, low humming filled the room, growing louder, vibrating the floor beneath his feet. It was as though the room itself was alive, reacting to the power the painting had brought into the space. Ethan wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though he were rooted to the spot. He couldn't look away from Mia, though every instinct told him to turn his back and flee. Her body was now contorted, her arms stretched at odd angles, her head turning in unnatural ways. The blackness in her eyes had deepened to a point where it seemed as if she had become nothing more than a shell. And yet, despite her horrific transformation, there was still a trace of something familiar in her, a flicker of the woman he had known. Her mouth moved ever so slightly, forming words that Ethan could barely hear, but he strained to catch them. "Help me!" The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the past few weeks, of their shared obsession with the painting, crash down on him. He had been so consumed by the idea of completing the work, so wrapped up in his own desperation to prove something, that he had failed to see the dangers lurking just beneath the surface. Now, standing in this twisted, darkened room, he could see how far they had fallen, how far Mia had fallen. But even as he realized the horror of their situation, a part of him, the artist within, felt the pull of the painting. It was a lure that he could not ignore, a seductive force that whispered to him in a voice not unlike Mia's. It promised answers. It promised understanding. It promised the kind of artistic transcendence that few ever achieved. Ethan felt his fingers twitch involuntarily, as though they were reaching for a brush or a tool, ready to add another stroke to the canvas. He fought it, but the pull was overwhelming. He knew what he had to do. Mia had been the one to complete the painting, but now it was his turn to finish it, to close the door. The thought of what that might entail filled him with terror, but he knew it was the only way. He had to destroy the painting before it consumed everything, before it took Mia, and before it reached beyond the room and into the world. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Ethan approached the canvas, each step feeling heavier than the last. The darkness within the painting seemed to stretch outward, reaching toward him as though it had recognized his presence, eager to pull him in. He could feel the heat radiating from it, an oppressive force that burned his skin. His hand hovered above the canvas, trembling, as if the very act of touching it would damn him forever. With a violent motion, he grabbed the nearest paintbrush, dipping it into the darkest color he could find. His hand shook, but he forced himself to move, to push the brush across the surface. As the bristles met the canvas, a sharp, piercing sound echoed through the room, like a scream caught in the fabric of the air. The painting resisted, the surface writhing under his touch, but Ethan pressed on. He didn't know what would happen next, but he could not let it consume Mia completely. With every stroke of the brush, the room seemed to grow darker. The painting became more agitated, as if it were fighting against his actions. The shadows in the room stretched longer, curling around his body like unseen hands. The oppressive hum in the air grew louder, now almost deafening. Ethan's vision blurred, the room spinning around him as the lines on the painting began to shift, morphing into something even more terrible. He could feel the energy from the painting surging through his veins, trying to claim him. He was no longer painting to create. He was painting to destroy. The final stroke had to be made, and he had to do it before the painting consumed them both. But even as he applied the last stroke, the painting seemed to scream, and the entity behind it laughed, a sound so deep and guttural that it shook him to his core. It was too late. The air in the room felt suffocating, as though it had been sucked out, leaving only a thick, oppressive presence behind. Ethan staggered backward, his body trembling, his mind in a state of shock. He had thought that completing the final stroke, the act of destroying the painting, would bring some form of release. But instead, it had triggered something far worse, something far more dangerous. The room had become a twisted reflection of the nightmare within the canvas. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, their surfaces rippling as though they were alive. Ethan could hear the faint whispers of voices, muffled and distant, coming from every corner of the room. He wanted to run, to escape this hellish place, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The darkness in the painting had bled out, staining the entire room, and now it was spreading, crawling up the walls and seeping into the corners like ink and water. Mia's form was now completely unrecognizable. Her once human shape had become something altogether more grotesque, a writhing mass of twisted limbs and contorted features. She was no longer the woman he had known, the artist he had admired and loved. She had become a puppet, a vessel for something far darker, far more ancient. Her eyes, once filled with passion and determination, were now hollow voids, as though all the life within her had been consumed by the painting. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at her, unable to process what he was seeing. He had seen art transform people before, had seen the way it could consume an artist's soul, but this was something entirely different. It was as if Mia's very essence had been ripped from her, replaced by whatever entity had been lurking beneath the surface of the painting. The whispers in the room grew louder, now sharp and insistent, as if the very walls were speaking to him, urging him to listen, to understand. The voices were distorted, and yet Ethan could swear he recognized some of them. There were fragments of Mia's voice, fractured and broken, calling out to him, begging for help. But underneath that, there were other voices darker, more malevolent, that seemed to mock his every thought. They spoke of the ancient power that had been unleashed, of the price that would be paid for meddling with forces beyond comprehension. Ethan's mind spun, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The painting, the ritual, the forces he had unknowingly awakened. It was all coming to a head, and he had no idea how to stop it. He had tried to destroy the painting, tried to put an end to it, but in doing so, he had only made things worse. The entity was not just contained within the painting. It had infiltrated the very fabric of reality itself, and now it was spreading, seeping into the world beyond the walls of the studio. He reached out to Mia, his hands trembling as he touched her twisted form. There was no response, no sign of recognition. She was lost to him now, consumed by whatever had taken hold of her. Ethan felt a pang of grief, sharp and raw, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something far darker. A sense of guilt, of responsibility, weighed heavily on his chest. He had pushed her to this, had encouraged her obsession with the painting. Had he known what they were truly dealing with? Had he ignored the warnings, dismissed the strange occurrences that had begun happening around them? Ethan pulled away from her, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He had to find a way out. He had to stop this before it spread beyond this room, before it consumed everything he had ever known. He turned toward the door, but it was no longer there. The once familiar entryway had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of darkness, as though the space itself had folded in on itself. He pounded his fists against the wall, but it was no use. He was trapped. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder still, now an overwhelming cacophony that threatened to tear at his sanity. The room seemed to shift and warp, and Ethan's vision blurred. He staggered back, his mind racing as he realized that the room, the entire space, was no longer what it seemed. The boundaries between reality and the nightmare he had unleashed were dissolving. He was no longer in the art studio he had known. He was somewhere else, somewhere darker, where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he spun around, heart racing, to find no one there. But the touch lingered, and with it came a feeling of utter dread. It was as if something ancient and evil, was standing just behind him, waiting for the moment to strike. The room began to pulse with a rhythmic throb, the dark energy from the painting now suffusing every corner of the space. The whispers were no longer distant. They were right beside him, all around him, growing more insistent, more urgent. Ethan's breathing grew shallow as he clutched at his chest, feeling as if the very air was choking him. His vision blurred further, the shadows twisting in ways that defied logic, taking on shapes, forms he could not comprehend. In that moment, Ethan realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The painting had not been destroyed. It had merely been released. Whatever entity had been trapped within it was now free, and it would stop at nothing to claim the world outside. Mia was lost, her body nothing more than a vessel for this dark power. And he, too, was trapped in its grip, caught in a world where the very fabric of reality had been unraveled by his own hand. The finality of the situation hit Ethan like a physical blow. The art, the obsession, the endless pursuit of creation, it had all led to this. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, whatever horrors awaited him, would be the result of his own choices. But in the deep, dark recesses of his mind, he could hear a whisper, a voice that was both familiar and alien, promising him that he had only just begun to understand what true creation meant. And in that moment, he realized there was no end to the cycle, only a beginning. In the days following the chaos that had engulfed Ethan's world, he found himself caught in a web of confusion, grief, and helplessness. The physical world seemed like a distant memory, a life he no longer recognized. He could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was merely the manifestation of the horror that had consumed him. He walked through the wreckage of his life like a ghost, wandering through the spaces he once knew with no sense of purpose, no direction. The studio was a hollow shell, its walls now lifeless and still, yet he could not shake the feeling that it was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. The painting, or rather, what it had become, lingered in his mind, its presence looming over him like a dark cloud. He had thought that by destroying it, by destroying Mia's work, he would put an end to the nightmare. But in his attempt to erase it, to rid the world of its evil, he had only unleashed something far worse. It wasn't the painting that had consumed them. It was the darkness within it, an ancient force that had used their obsession as a vessel, a means to escape into the real world. Mia had known this. He realized this now, too late. She had known what she was inviting into their lives, what they were both complicit in creating. Mia had always been an enigma, a person driven by an insatiable thirst for understanding and expression. She had pushed herself, sometimes too hard, to reach the limits of her craft, to delve into the darker aspects of creation. Ethan had admired her dedication, her passion, the way she could pour herself into her art. But it had been that very passion that had led her down a path of destruction. She had become consumed by the work, unable to break free from the pull of the painting and its strange influence. In the end, the art had been more than just a medium. It had been a conduit for something far more sinister, something that had now taken root in the world. Ethan's memories of the moments before Mia's transformation were fractured, like broken glass, each shard cutting deeper into his psyche. The moments when he had tried to pull her away, when he had begged her to stop, felt distant and unreal, as though they had happened to someone else. She had been there, and then she had not. Her body had twisted, her soul lost to the malevolent force within the painting. The very idea that she could be replaced, that she had become a mere vessel for the darkness, was a thought that haunted Ethan relentlessly. But the deeper truth gnawed at him. Mia had never been fully hers to begin with. She had always been drawn to the abyss, and it was that same darkness that had claimed her in the end. Now, Ethan was alone, left with the consequences of his actions. The darkness was not confined to the walls of the studio. It was everywhere. It seeped into the streets, the buildings, the very fabric of the city itself. He could feel it in the air, an unsettling heaviness that clung to everything. The whispers had not stopped. They had only grown louder, more insistent. They spoke to him in fragments of words, incoherent, yet chilling in their repetition. They were the remnants of whatever had been released, fragments of the force that had been waiting for its chance to escape. They had found their way into Ethan's thoughts, twisting and distorting his perceptions of reality. Every corner he turned, every shadow that fell upon him, felt as though it were an extension of the painting, the art that had birthed this nightmare. He thought about reaching out for help, but who could he trust? The world outside had become a twisted version of itself, a reflection of the chaos that had erupted within the studio. People moved through the streets as if nothing had changed, unaware of the darkness that had seeped into the very foundation of their existence. Ethan had tried to speak to a few of them, but their eyes were vacant, their responses hollow. He had tried to warn them, to explain what had happened, but they dismissed him as mad, a delusional man driven by guilt and grief. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen the things he had seen, experienced the horrors he had witnessed. It was clear now that the darkness was spreading, that it was influencing more than just his thoughts. It was spreading through the people, through the city itself, slowly overtaking everything in its path. Ethan could sense it, this pervasive sense of unease that seemed to be creeping into every interaction, every moment. He had become a shadow of himself, a reflection of what he once was, constantly hunted by the knowledge that he had played a role in this. It had started with the painting, but it had grown beyond that. The darkness was no longer confined to the art. It had become part of the world, part of the very air they breathed. There was no way to escape it. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in on him. He was trapped, both by the physical confines of his surroundings and the psychological grip the darkness had on him. The whispers had become so loud that they drowned out everything else. At night, when he tried to sleep, they would invade his dreams, twisting his thoughts, distorting his visions of the world. He saw flashes of Mia, but not the woman he had loved. She was no longer human. Her face had become an amalgamation of all the horrors that had been unleashed in the painting. She was a part of it now, a twisted reflection of what had been created. Ethan knew that he had to do something. He couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a world that was slowly collapsing under the weight of his own mistakes. He had to find a way to end it, to put an end to the spreading darkness before it consumed everything. But as he stood there, staring into the reflection of himself in the window, he realized that there was no easy answer. The painting, the entity it had released, it had become a part of him, as much a part of the world as the air he breathed. There was no way to undo what had been done. There was no way to escape the consequences of his actions. The truth was terrifying. The darkness had already won, and there was nothing Ethan could do to stop it. The only choice now was whether to succumb to it entirely or to fight, to try to resist the pull, even as the very world around him seemed to decay and fall into madness. Ethan's resolve, once tempered by uncertainty, had shifted into something altogether darker. The realization that he could not reverse the damage done, the quiet yet insidious spread of the darkness, felt like a death sentence. But as much as he sought to hide from the truth, there was an undeniable pull to confront it. It was as if the chaos that had erupted from the painting, from Mia's transformation, had left a stain on his very soul. The only way forward, or so it seemed, was to explore this new reality, even if it led to further torment. The city had changed in ways that defied logic. People walked through the streets, their faces vacantly empty, unaware of the growing infection beneath their feet. There was a persistent unease in the air, a hum of something insidious that vibrated in the background, constantly threatening to break the surface of everyday life. It wasn't just the people who were affected. The very environment seemed to be reacting to the malevolent force. Buildings once vibrant with life were now cracked, their paint peeling, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. The weather, too, reflected the shift, with an oppressive fog that clung to everything, as if the city itself were being smothered. Ethan could not escape the feeling that he was at the center of this transformation. The darkness had latched onto him, its cold fingers wrapping around his thoughts, distorting everything he had once known. Even his reflections seemed to mock him, warping his perception of reality. Every time he looked into a mirror, he saw something different, a face that wasn't entirely his, a figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. It was as if the boundaries between the world he once knew and the one that was now encroaching were becoming increasingly porous. He had tried to reach out to others, to find someone who could offer a semblance of clarity, but those attempts only served to confirm his growing suspicion. No one could see what he saw. The people around him were oblivious, their eyes fixed on mundane concerns, as though they were insulated from the very fabric of the reality that was slowly unraveling. The more Ethan tried to share his experiences, the more detached they seemed, as if he were speaking in riddles. They dismissed him as unwell, a man spiraling into madness, a fate that seemed to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yet, he knew that what he was experiencing was not mere delusion. It was something far more tangible, something that had weight, substance, and a malevolent purpose. The painting still haunted him, its absence only amplifying its presence. It had been destroyed, or so he thought, but something about the process of its destruction had felt wrong. When he had set the flames to it, he had expected to feel a release, a sense of finality. Instead, there had been only a sickening shift, as if the painting's influence had morphed into something else, something more pervasive. It was no longer confined to a physical object. The horror had seeped out, becoming a part of the world around him. It was in the creaking of the floorboards, the erratic behavior of the weather, the whispers in the night that echoed in his ears when he tried to sleep. Ethan was starting to wonder if Mia had never truly understood the full extent of what she was unleashing. Perhaps she had thought she could control it, but now it was beyond her, beyond any of them. As time passed, Ethan began to notice a subtle change in the way he moved through the world. The very act of stepping outside, of walking through the city, felt more like an intrusion into a space that was no longer his. The familiar streets had turned alien, as if the city itself were slowly shifting, growing, expanding into something unrecognizable. It was as if the landscape were mirroring his internal descent. No longer was he a man walking through his own life. He was a spectator in a world that no longer obeyed the rules of logic and reason. His senses were heightened, every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement heightened with the tension of a world that was slowly crumbling. The nights were the worst. It wasn't just the oppressive silence that filled the air, but the strange noises that seemed to come from the walls, the floors, the very foundation of the world around him. Sometimes, he would hear muffled voices in the dead of night, whispers too faint to understand, but clear enough to send a chill crawling down his spine. Other times, the sounds were harsher, more insistent, like the scraping of metal against stone or the thumping of footsteps that seemed to approach from every direction. Each night, it was as if the dark forces surrounding him were testing their hold on reality, pushing against the fragile walls of his mind. Desperation began to take hold. He knew that the darkness was not going to simply fade away. It had its own momentum, its own trajectory. It was as if Ethan were standing at the edge of a precipice, looking out over an abyss that was pulling everything into its depths. He could feel the pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw him in, urging him to step into the unknown. Yet, there was a part of him that still resisted. He wanted to believe that there was hope, that there was a way to stop the relentless spread of this nightmare. But deep down, he knew it was already too late for that. It was then that a thought struck him. A thought so simple, yet so terrifying in its implications, that he could not shake it. What if this was not just his nightmare, not just a consequence of his involvement with the painting? What if this was something larger, something that had always been waiting to emerge? Perhaps the darkness was not the creation of one man or one woman, but something that had always existed, hidden beneath the surface of the world. What if the painting had merely been the trigger, the catalyst for something far older and more dangerous? The more Ethan pondered this possibility, the more the weight of it settled on him. The darkness was not a force he could fight. It was a part of the very world he had lived in, a force that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The boundaries between the visible and the unseen were thinner than he had ever imagined. The art, the obsession, Mia, these were all just steps in a process that was inevitable. Ethan had been a part of it, but so had the world around him. The terrifying truth was that there was no escape. The horizon that had once seemed so clear now seemed distant, unreachable, a place where the shadows stretched endlessly, pulling everything into them. In this realization, Ethan saw no redemption. There was no heroic act that could undo the damage. There was only the slow, inevitable collapse into the darkness. And he, like everyone else, would be swallowed whole. Ethan awoke in the early hours of the morning to the relentless hum of an unsettling silence. The world outside his window was cloaked in the kind of stillness that only deepened his sense of isolation. He had not been able to sleep well in weeks. Each night, a restless battle between the pull of exhaustion and the sharp, jagged thoughts that never seemed to leave him. But now, there was something different about the air, something in the way the light filtered through his curtains, dull and heavy, as if it too were struggling against the weight of the darkness that had become his constant companion. His first instinct was to ignore it, to retreat back into the bubble of disbelief he had carefully constructed around himself. He had told himself time and again that the strange happenings in the city, the eerie whispers, and the unexplainable occurrences were all the product of his overactive imagination. But deep down, Ethan knew better. He had seen the signs, felt the shifts in reality that no one else seemed to notice. The world was changing, and he was caught in the middle of it. The paintings, the gallery, Mia, none of it had been random. It was all connected in a way he couldn't fully grasp, but he understood one thing. The darkness was not done with him. It was only just beginning. The urge to confront it had grown stronger in the past few days. Ethan had spent the last few weeks consumed by a sense of paralysis, trapped between the fear of facing the truth and the realization that there was no escaping it. Now something inside him had shifted. The terror that once kept him rooted in place was slowly transforming into something else. Curiosity, a dangerous pull toward the unknown. It was as though the abyss itself was calling to him, beckoning him to step closer to the edge. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to answer that call. Mia's transformation had been only the beginning, Ethan realized. She had become a vessel, an unwilling conduit for whatever dark force was festering beneath the surface of the world. Her final moments before she succumbed to the painting's influence had been marked by an eerie serenity, as though she had finally accepted something that Ethan still struggled to comprehend. He had tried to save her, of course. He had tried to understand what was happening to her, tried to find a way to stop it before it was too late. But it had been futile. Mia was gone, and in her place was something far worse. A creature not bound by the rules of human life, but by something older, something that predated humanity itself. As Ethan wandered through the city, the oppressive fog that had settled over the streets seemed to press in on him from all sides. It wasn't just the atmosphere that had changed, it was the people too. The once bustling college campus where he had spent so many years of his life was now eerily quiet, its halls silent and vacant. The few students who remained seemed to be drifting aimlessly, their eyes dull and vacant, as though they were no longer aware of the world around them. Their movements were sluggish, their actions mechanical, as if they were puppets on invisible strings. In the midst of this surreal emptiness, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was as though the city itself had become a living organism, aware of his every step, his every thought. There were no longer any clear boundaries between him and the world around him. The lines between reality and nightmare had blurred, and Ethan was left to navigate a landscape where the rules no longer applied. He found himself drawn to the gallery again, to the place where it all began. There was a strange pull, as if something in the gallery was calling to him, luring him back into its depths. But he hesitated. He had already destroyed the painting, had already watched as it crumbled into ash. What more could he possibly find there? Yet, despite his doubts, his legs carried him toward it, the weight of the decision settling heavily in his chest. The gallery was dark when he arrived, the lights flickering in a way that made the walls seem to pulse, breathing in and out as though alive. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered in the corners. Ethan couldn't help but wonder how much of the darkness that had been unleashed was tied to this very place, to the painting that had begun it all. But as he walked deeper into the gallery, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if the gallery were pulling the warmth from his very body. It was then that he saw it, an empty frame, one that hadn't been there before. A frame that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, its edges glowing faintly in the darkness. Ethan approached the frame slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The painting that should have been destroyed was somehow still here, suspended in the frame as though it had never been touched. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. And in that instant, everything changed. The world around him began to distort. The edges of the gallery seemed to warp and bend, the walls stretching out like rubber. The sound of his own breathing became distorted, muffled, as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. Before he could react, a figure appeared before him, shadowy, indistinct at first, but slowly taking shape. It was Mia, or what was left of her. Her form flickered like a broken film reel, her features shifting and shifting again, no longer human, no longer anything recognizable. And yet, there was something in her eyes, something that drew Ethan in, something that whispered to him in a voice that seemed to echo in his mind. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice a hollow rasp, as though it was coming from far, far away. "It's too late now." Ethan staggered back, his mind racing. This was impossible. Mia had died. The painting had been destroyed. But the figure before him was real. The terror that had been building in him since the first moment he had encountered the darkness now reached its apex. He knew now that the abyss was not just something outside him. It was within him, within everyone. It had been waiting, patient and insidious, feeding off their fear, their doubts, their very souls. Ethan realized with a cold clarity that there was no escaping this. The painting, the gallery, Mia, these were only pieces of the larger puzzle. The true horror lay not in the artifact, but in what it represented. The breaking of boundaries, the tearing down of the walls that separated the seen from the unseen, the living from the dead. The call of the abyss was not something external. It was inside him, inside the very fabric of reality, pulling everything toward its center. As the figure of Mia reached out toward him, Ethan finally understood the truth. There was no escape. The darkness had already claimed him, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed everyone else. The world as he knew it was slipping away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the void. And in that void, there would be no light, no hope, no return. Only the call of the abyss. The revelation of the abyss had been both terrifying and oddly liberating. Ethan stood at the edge of a precipice, gazing into the darkness that had begun to consume not just the gallery, but the entire fabric of his existence. The figure of Mia had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the oppressive weight of her words and the eerie silence of the gallery. As he stood there, trying to comprehend the depths of the horror that was unfolding around him, one question echoed in his mind. What now? The answer, though elusive, seemed to hover just beneath the surface, waiting for him to grasp it. In the days that followed, Ethan's perception of reality began to unravel. The city that had once felt familiar and grounded now seemed like a distorted, fractured version of itself. The streets stretched out impossibly far. The sky was always a shade too gray, and people moved through the world with an eerie disconnection, as though they were no longer aware of their own existence. The boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred, and Ethan felt himself caught in the middle, suspended in a world where nothing made sense and everything was terrifyingly unpredictable. He tried to make sense of the changes he had experienced. The gallery, the painting, Mia's transformation. Everything was connected, but how? He felt as though the answers were just out of reach, like trying to catch a fleeting shadow. There were moments when he thought he understood, when the pieces seemed to fall into place, only for them to slip away before he could make sense of them. But one thing had become clear. Whatever was happening was not just affecting him. It was spreading, slowly but surely, consuming everything in its path. Ethan's encounters with the gallery had left him shaken, but there was something else, something more insidious, gnawing at him. In the weeks since Mia's death, her transformation, her destruction, he had begun to experience strange sensations. His body felt lighter at times, as though the weight of the world had been stripped away. But then, moments later, a crushing heaviness would settle over him, and he would feel as though the very air around him was closing in. His mind would race, and he would find himself unable to breathe, unable to think clearly. The city around him seemed to react to his own internal turmoil. The world was not just changing, it was responding to him, bending and warping in ways that seemed impossible. Ethan had heard stories of people losing themselves in their own minds, of individuals falling victim to madness, but he had never believed them. Until now, he had always been in control, always able to separate the real from the imagined. But now, the lines had blurred. He could no longer tell if he was dreaming or awake, if the horrors he saw were real or just figments of his broken mind. It was then that he realized something terrible. The painting was not the only thing that had changed. The city itself had become a mirror, reflecting the darkness that was growing within him. It was as if the corruption he had witnessed in the gallery was seeping into everything, infecting the very ground beneath his feet. People who had once been vibrant, full of life, were now fading into the background, their faces expressionless and empty. The laughter of children no longer echoed through the streets. Instead, there was only the hum of a distant, invisible force that seemed to guide the actions of everyone around him. The faculty at the college had begun to act strange as well. Professors who had once been pillars of knowledge and wisdom now wandered the halls in a daze, their lectures incoherent, their eyes vacant. It wasn't just a lack of focus. It was as though they were no longer aware of themselves, as though they were puppets moving through the motions of their lives without ever truly living. Ethan had always admired the professors, respected their expertise and their passion. But now, he could see the cracks beneath their polished exteriors, the hollow shells they had become. Despite the growing dread that gnawed at him, Ethan couldn't escape the magnetic pull of the gallery. He was drawn to it again and again, compelled to return even though he knew it would only bring more suffering. Each visit to the gallery felt like stepping deeper into the unknown, like descending further into the abyss. The once beautiful paintings that filled the walls now seemed to shift before his eyes, their subjects morphing into grotesque, nightmarish versions of themselves. Faces twisted in anguish, hands reaching out in desperate pleas, and eyes that seemed to follow him, even when he wasn't looking. One afternoon, as he entered the gallery once more, Ethan found himself face to face with something he had not seen before. It was another painting, one that he hadn't noticed in any of his previous visits. The frame was dark and ornate, the edges gleaming with a faint, unnatural light. The painting depicted a familiar scene, the college campus, with its sprawling lawns and towering buildings. But there was something wrong about it. The figures in the painting, students, professors, faculty, were not just depicted in the scene. They were trapped within it, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Ethan's heart raced as he approached the painting. He could feel the pull of it, the same force that had drawn him to the previous painting, the one that had destroyed Mia. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the glass, and for a moment, he thought he saw one of the figures in the painting, one of the professors, blink. It was as if they were alive, as if the painting had come to life in front of him. He quickly recoiled, his breath shallow and rapid. Was he losing his mind, or was this real? The terror that had been building within him now reached a crescendo. The city, the gallery, the painting, everything was connected, and everything was slipping further into the grip of darkness. Ethan could feel the tendrils of the abyss wrapping themselves around his mind, threatening to pull him under. He had tried to resist, tried to fight against the creeping madness that seemed to be taking over, but it was no use. The more he resisted, the stronger it became. The abyss had found him, and now it would not let go. As he stumbled back from the painting, the world around him began to shift once more. The gallery walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. Ethan's vision blurred, and he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. In that moment, he understood the full extent of what was happening. The painting was not just a gateway to darkness. It was a living thing, feeding off his fear, his confusion, his very soul. And as he stared at the figure trapped in the painting, he knew that he was next. The abyss had come for him, and there was no escape. In the aftermath of his encounter with the painting, Ethan found himself submerged in a profound sense of unease that pervaded every corner of his life. The gallery, once a place of inspiration and discovery, had transformed into something far more sinister. The walls, the paintings, the very air, everything felt like it was suffocating him, drawing him deeper into a world that seemed to be rejecting reality itself. He could no longer walk through the streets of the city without the unsettling sensation that he was being watched, followed by unseen eyes. The people he passed by had become mere shadows, their faces blank slates that seemed to mirror the emptiness he felt inside. Ethan's mind had become a battleground between logic and terror. He had spent sleepless nights trying to understand what had happened, trying to piece together the jarring experience of the painting, Mia's transformation, and the strange changes in the world around him. There was no answer that made sense, no explanation that offered him solace. Every time he thought he had a grasp on the situation, another bizarre event would unfold, further proving that his understanding of reality was slipping away. The sensation of being watched grew more intense, as if something, some force, was always just behind him, waiting to pounce. At times, he could swear he heard whispers, faint and disjointed, that seemed to come from the shadows. They never made sense, only adding to the confusion that had become his constant companion. There was no one to turn to for help. The faculty at the college were becoming more distant, their once insightful and animated conversations now reduced to disjointed mutterings. It was as if they were all under the same spell, bound by the same curse that had entranced Ethan. It wasn't just the college that had changed. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling. Ethan would walk through the streets only to find that they had shifted overnight. Landmarks he had passed 100 times were suddenly gone, replaced by unfamiliar, distorted versions of themselves. Buildings loomed over him like dark, twisted versions of their former selves, their architecture strange and unsettling, as though they were no longer following the rules of the physical world. The city was folding in on itself, each turn revealing more disorienting, nightmarish versions of the world he thought he knew. And then there was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that Mia was still there, lingering in the spaces between breaths in the shadows of the gallery. Ethan had not seen her since the night she had disappeared, but he felt her presence constantly. It was as though she had left a piece of herself behind, a fragment of her consciousness embedded in the walls of the gallery. When he closed his eyes, he could see her face, twisted in agony, as if she were pleading with him to understand the truth. What had she become? What had he awakened in her? The questions gnawed at him, and yet he found no answers, only more dread. His attempts to distance himself from the gallery were futile. The more he tried to forget, the more it seemed to pull him back. He had ventured to other parts of the city in an effort to escape its grip, but each time he returned, he found that something had changed. The air grew heavier with each passing day, and the very walls of his apartment began to close in around him. His thoughts became consumed with the idea that he was being trapped, that the world was slowly turning into something unrecognizable, something that no longer followed the rules of physics, time, or reason. The more Ethan tried to break free, the tighter the noose around his neck became. Then came the moment that pushed him to the edge. One evening, as he walked past the familiar, crumbling building that housed the gallery, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a student from his class, one of the few people Ethan still felt connected to in this increasingly alien world. The student's face was pale, drawn, as though he had seen something he was not meant to see. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The figure's lips parted, and the whisper that followed sent a chill through Ethan's spine. "I saw it too. The painting, it's alive." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected for weeks that the gallery was more than just a place. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had not been privy to his experiences, was a shock that left him breathless. The student's words were not just a passing comment. They were a confession, a confirmation of what Ethan had feared. The paintings, the gallery, it was all part of something far darker, far more sinister than he had imagined. The student's next words were even more chilling. "I think it's trying to pull us in to become a part of us. I can feel it." Before Ethan could respond, the student turned and disappeared into the building, leaving Ethan standing alone in the street, his mind racing. What did this mean? What was the painting trying to do? Was it trying to capture people, to consume them as it had done to Mia? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into a larger, more terrifying web, one that was slowly but inexorably pulling everyone around him into its depths. That night, sleep came reluctantly. As Ethan lay in his bed, his mind flickering between the terrifying possibilities, he was struck by a sudden realization. What if the paintings were not just objects to be admired or feared? What if they were the key to everything? What if the gallery was not just a place, but a doorway, a portal to something far more ancient, far more powerful than he could understand? Could it be that the paintings were alive, not just in the sense that they changed, but in the sense that they were conscious, aware, and in control? The thought consumed him, gnawing at his mind like an insatiable hunger. The whispers he had heard, the changes he had witnessed. What if they were all part of a grand design, a plan that had been set in motion long before Ethan had ever set foot in the gallery? The more he pondered it, the more certain he became that there was something larger at play, something that went beyond the confines of the college, beyond even the city itself. In the end, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening was not just a personal nightmare. It was a contagion, a force that was spreading, taking hold of everything and everyone it touched. And if he didn't find a way to break free from its grasp, he would become just another part of its dark, twisted masterpiece. Ethan had reached a breaking point. The creeping dread that had consumed his every waking moment had evolved into an overwhelming force, clawing at his sanity, dragging him further into the abyss. His attempts to understand, to rationalize, had failed him entirely. The world around him had become unrecognizable, an ever-shifting nightmare where logic no longer applied. The paintings, those living, breathing entities, had woven themselves into the very fabric of his existence, and he could no longer escape their grasp. The more he struggled, the more it seemed they drew him in, tightening their hold until he was certain he could no longer break free. The gallery, once a place of artistic admiration, now felt like a tomb. Its walls no longer whispered inspiration, but rather murmured in ominous tones, beckoning Ethan into their depths. He had avoided returning for days, retreating into the bleak solitude of his apartment, where the air itself felt thick with the weight of impending doom. But as the days passed, the sensation of being trapped grew stronger. The city around him continued to distort, as though it were losing its form, becoming a facsimile of itself. Buildings that had once been grounded in reality now floated like fragile, broken shells. Streets curved and twisted into impossible angles, leading nowhere and yet everywhere. Ethan's mind had become a fractured landscape of confusion. Each time he thought he understood what was happening, a new layer of terror would reveal itself. He could no longer trust his senses, for every corner of his reality seemed to be warping in unpredictable ways. The gallery, however, remained a constant, its pull like gravity, inescapable and insistent. He knew, deep down, that the only way to end this nightmare was to face it head-on, to confront whatever had taken root in that cursed space. The gallery was the source, the heart of the dark transformation that had consumed his world. But what awaited him inside? As he walked toward the gallery once more, Ethan could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him. His every step felt heavier than the last, as though the very ground beneath him was conspiring to keep him from reaching his destination. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was a quiet resolve in his movements. He could not run anymore. There was no place left to hide. The gallery awaited, and with it, the truth. Or perhaps a deeper, more terrifying lie. The doors of the gallery loomed before him, impossibly tall, as if they were stretching into another dimension. Their once welcoming frame now felt like the threshold between worlds, a place where the known and the unknown collided in a violent clash. As Ethan pushed the doors open, the familiar smell of old wood and oil paints hit him with an overwhelming force. The air inside was thick, saturated with something more than just dust and paint. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with a malevolent energy, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to unravel him completely. Inside, the gallery was darker than it had ever been. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. The paintings, the same paintings that had tormented him for weeks, were now more alive than ever. Their colors bled and shifted like liquid, their forms changing in real time, as if they were not mere depictions of reality, but distortions of it. Ethan's heart raced as his eyes darted from one canvas to the next, each one more horrifying than the last. Faces twisted in silent screams, figures caught in perpetual motion, all trapped in their eternal dance within the frames. They were no longer just images. They were alive, and they were waiting for him. But it was one painting, one image that caught his attention more than the others. It was a portrait, though it was unlike anything he had seen before. The figure depicted was a woman, her features strikingly familiar. At first, Ethan couldn't place it, until his eyes locked onto the eyes of the woman in the painting. They were Mia's eyes, the same haunting, vacant expression he had seen in the gallery's reflection. She was there, trapped within the canvas, her body contorted in unnatural angles, as though she had been captured mid-scream. Her eyes bore into Ethan's soul, pulling him toward the painting, urging him to come closer, to understand what had happened to her. He approached the painting, his body moving against his will, as though it were not his own. As he drew closer, the world around him seemed to blur and distort, the very air thickening with the weight of the painting's presence. Ethan reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the canvas. The surface was warm, pulsing with an unnatural life of its own. Suddenly, the painting shifted. The woman's form twisted violently, and Ethan felt an icy chill surge through his spine. Her mouth opened, though no sound came from her lips. But in that moment, Ethan understood. The painting was not just a piece of art. It was a doorway, a vessel through which the gallery's darkness was reaching out, pulling him into its depths. The force that had held Ethan in its thrall now seemed to seize him completely. His mind was flooded with images, flashes of disjointed memories, scenes from his life, twisted and distorted. He saw himself in the gallery, saw Mia's transformation, saw the dark force behind it all. It was as if the painting was unraveling the very fabric of his existence, showing him every moment that had led him to this point. The gallery was not just a place of art. It was a living organism, feeding off the emotions and experiences of those who entered. It had absorbed everything, every moment of fear, every ounce of despair, and now it was consuming him. In the painting, Mia's form began to change once again. The twisted, agonized expression on her face softened, and her eyes suddenly shimmered with recognition. She was no longer trapped. She was free, but not in the way Ethan had hoped. She was the gallery now, a part of its dark, malevolent essence. And as her gaze locked with his, Ethan felt himself slipping away, his identity blurring, dissolving into the painting, becoming part of the nightmare. The world around him began to fade, the colors bleeding together in a chaotic whirl. The last thing Ethan heard was the faintest whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was Mia's voice, but it wasn't the Mia he knew. It was something else, something that had been forged in the darkness of the gallery. "Welcome home, Ethan." And then there was nothing. The gallery had consumed everything. Ethan's body, his memories, his very existence. Everything was now part of it. The eerie silence that enveloped the space now felt absolute, a suffocating stillness that was almost deafening. He was no longer just a visitor within the gallery's walls. He had become the gallery, or at least a part of it. His identity had been stripped away, absorbed into the dark tapestry of the paintings, the very thing he had once sought to understand. In the final moments of his consciousness, there had been nothing but the overwhelming sense of being both everywhere and nowhere, of existing in a space that was both his own and alien to him. But now, as the gallery continued to pulse with an unseen life, there was a strange shift in the air, a subtle change that Ethan could feel, despite no longer having a form to feel with. It was as though the gallery, for all its twisted darkness, was beginning to adjust. The paintings, the living entities that once drove him to madness, seemed to pause, their colors frozen in place. The air was still, not heavy with terror, but with something else, something that felt like an end. For a long while, Ethan was trapped in that endless, weightless space, unable to move, unable to think. Then it began to happen. Fragments of his memories, scattered and disjointed, returned to him. It was as though his consciousness had started to regenerate, to reassemble itself in pieces. He recalled his life before the gallery, the days spent in the art college, the passion he had once felt for his work, the connections he had with others, the fleeting moments of joy, and the deep, unspoken sadness that had always lingered beneath the surface. But all of it, now, seemed distant, unreal, like the remnants of a dream that had no place in this nightmarish world. As his thoughts began to solidify, so too did the landscape around him. He saw himself, standing before the canvas where Mia had once been trapped. But she was gone now, or perhaps she had never been there in the first place. The woman in the painting was no longer the tormented figure he had once feared. Instead, the canvas seemed empty, as though it had been wiped clean. But Ethan knew better than to trust what he saw. The gallery never let anything go. Nothing could truly be erased here. It could only be transformed. He felt a strange, cold sensation wash over him as the gallery around him seemed to stretch and twist. The familiar paintings that had once seemed so alive now hung, still and silent. The walls felt as though they were closing in, but instead of the suffocating fear he had known, there was a sense of quiet resignation. The gallery, it seemed, had finally reached its conclusion. The darkness that had once consumed him was no longer inescapable. It was simply a part of him now. But even in this moment of stillness, Ethan could sense that something had changed. There was a shift, a subtle crack in the darkness, like a faint glimmer of light that threatened to break through. It wasn't hope. Hope was a concept foreign to this place. But there was something else, something akin to understanding. As Ethan's consciousness fully reformed, he began to realize the true nature of the gallery. It wasn't just a cursed place of torment. It was a manifestation of his own mind, his own fears and desires. The gallery had not consumed him because it was an external force. No, it had consumed him because he had given it power, because he had created it. Ethan had come to this place, willingly or not, because he was searching for something, perhaps for meaning, for answers, for a way to understand the darkness that had always loomed over him. In his obsession with the art, in his desire to understand the paintings, he had unknowingly invited the very force he had feared into his life. The gallery was a reflection of his own internal struggles, a mirror that had shown him the horrors he had refused to face. And now, as he floated in the void, he understood. The gallery was not just a physical space, it was a prison of his own making. Yet even with this realization, Ethan did not feel the sense of freedom he might have expected. There was no triumphant moment of clarity. The gallery had no redemption to offer. It was not a place where the lost could find their way back, where the broken could be healed. It simply was an inescapable reflection of his deepest fears, a place where time did not exist, and everything was endlessly repeating. He had been a part of it, and now, perhaps, it had become a part of him. The last brushstroke was painted. The final act had been completed. The gallery, Ethan realized, had no end. It was eternal. Those who entered were never truly gone, nor were they ever truly free. The paintings, the walls, the twisted forms, these were all fragments of something larger, something that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the physical world. As he stood within this infinite space, Ethan understood that there was no escape. There was only the art, only the gallery. And so, Ethan remained, a lost soul within the walls of the gallery. His body was gone, his mind fragmented, but the essence of who he was remained, woven into the very fabric of the art that had once tormented him. The gallery would continue to grow, to expand, to evolve, as it always had. And somewhere, within its endless halls, the paintings waited, alive and ever-changing, waiting for the next visitor to wander in, to fall under their spell, to become part of the gallery forever. The final brushstroke had been made, but the story was never finished.